We're gonna go ahead and just talk about the agenda for the next hour and 15 minutes. But while we're here, I also wanted to shout out this QR code that people that are coming in can scan just to pull up information about the Independent Budget Office. And if you want to follow us on socials, we do create pretty engaging social media content about the city budget. And you can also sign up for our newsletter where you will be getting information whenever we publish a new report. A lot of these reports are education related, so it might be something you're interested in. And you will also be the first to know about future workshops such as these. We're going to get started with the agenda. I'm first going to give a very brief overview of the Independent Budget Office and talk about our role in New York City government. I'm then going to hand it off to Julia. Julia is our Assistant Director for our education team. She's going to ground us just in some facts about the city budget regarding the timeline, some key dates, and then how the city budget intersects with the state and the federal budget. And then we're going to get into the interactive portion of this workshop where we are going to be going into the nitty-gritty, helping you pull up your school budget using some publicly available documents. And then in the last 30 minutes or so, we'll go into breakout rooms. And this will be a good chance for you to practice pulling up your school budget after our initial demonstration. And it would also give you a chance to ask us any questions that you might have about the DOE budget in general or about the school budget. So in terms of our role, the New York City Independent Budget Office is a nonpartisan city agency that translates complex budget issues into clear and accessible information for families, for advocates, and for policymakers. So when I say we're nonpartisan, that means that we don't report to any elected official's office, and we also don't take political stances. We don't make recommendations. And so we really just serve as an educational resource for people wanting to engage more and understand the city budget processes. In terms of what we do, I'll get into a couple examples of our work, but we are mandated to provide reports in alignment with major city budget actions, and we also answer questions from council members and the public. So I will also drop our website link towards the end of the workshop again, but there is a place on our new website where you can submit a question and one of our analysts will get back to you with a response. And that's a really handy way for you to get in touch with us and learn more about the city budget. So let's talk a bit about who we are. Julia and I are going to be staffing this workshop. Julia is our incredible assistant director of the education team. She is also a previous high school social studies teacher, so she really has an understanding too of the operational side of how New York City public schools run, and she taught in Brooklyn. She's actually not finished teaching either. She is also an assistant professor at NYU, but she helps to direct the research for our education team that really tracks the revenues and the spending for the Department of Education. Within the team, there are also people that kind of have expertise in certain areas. So, for example, we have an analyst named Caitlin, who is an expert at the School Construction Authority. And then we also have Emma, who looks a lot at early childhood education. Then me, my name is Hannah. I am a community engagement specialist. I also have a teaching background, so I was a middle school teacher, also in New York City, but I now work a lot with the education team, running these types of events, as well as doing outreach and presentations to community groups, so community boards, CECs, and anyone who wants to request these type of presentations. So in terms of our report, I know I mentioned that we are mandated to provide certain reports, but again, just to highlight some of those, we do publish these reports doing independent analysis of the city's revenues and expenditures, and these are done in alignment with the city's budget timeline. So whenever the Office of Management and Budget through the mayor's office releases one of their financial plans, we are required to publish independent responses to that. Throughout the year, we also publish reports that look into city spending and try to make them more understandable to the public. So just to highlight a couple from the education team that Julia will be dropping in the chat if you want to take a closer look. These are some of the ones that we published in the past year. We had an explainer on fair student funding, which is a funding formula through which New York City distributes funds to public schools. And then we also had a report on pre-K and 3K trends in New York City. This was a district level report where we were looking at utilization, capacity, and enrollment in different districts for pre-K and 3K around New York City. And it's a good way if you're interested in early childhood education to be able to look at your district information and then compare that to different districts around the city. Lastly, one of our reports that has been mentioned recently in Chalkbeat because of the heat waves that have been happening is Barriers to Learning, where we took a district and a school level look at accessibility, space usage, and air conditioning in New York City buildings. So if you look through this report, which is extremely accessible, there are lots of charts and graphs you can play around within this report. You'll be able to see how your district and your school does in terms of all these different angles. Lastly, we also give testimony at City Council as a city agency to provide our data findings. And then we also deliver presentations and create general resources to teach New Yorkers about the budget. So we do a lot of these Budget 101 presentations for different community groups, this type of school budget workshop. And then lastly, we also have been delivering classes to high school students, and we're expanding into college for those who want to learn about the New York City budget. With that being said, that's just a brief overview of the work that we do. Sorry, do you have a question? Okay. Um, that being said, I'm going to hand it off to Julia, and she's going to do some budget review for us.
Great, thanks, Hannah. Hello, everyone. So wonderful to see you here. So I'm going to talk through first the New York City budget timeline, and I'm going to point out both some things that are really important for the citywide budget process, and then some specific school-related timeline notes. So I'm actually going to start in the middle of this timeline at July, because that's where we are now. So you may have heard in the news that a budget was just passed. That's what's called the adopted budget. And it's actually the start of New York City's fiscal year. So in a way that's not helpful to any of us, New York City runs on a different fiscal year than the state of New York does and the federal government. So the New York City fiscal year has just begun, and the adopted budget looks forward to the next several years. So a budget is a financial plan, and it includes several years ahead. Over the course of the year, the mayor will make adjustments to that financial plan, and we see those at different dates. So in November, there's the next adjustment to the financial plan, and we see another one in January and April. So now I've looped back around to the start of my timeline. That January date is a really big one for the New York City budget timeline. It's called the preliminary budget, and it's where the mayor will also then extend his proposal for the budget, which I should have mentioned too. In July, the big change that happens that's different than those other timelines is that this proposal for a budget is then approved by the New York City Council. So that's a place where you see two different entities participate. The mayor is presenting a plan and City Council is approving it at the adopted budget. Another major moment in the New York City budget timeline is in April. That's what we call the executive budget. What's important about the executive budget is that it is supposed to reflect changes that have had some impact on New York City after the state budget was passed. So the state has their own timeline for their budget calendar. The state budget is passed. It should be passed by April. Sometimes it's a little late. And then we see in April, the New York City executive budget accounts for those changes. So that's sort of the loop of the New York City wide budget schedule. And now I'm going to talk and point out three particularly important points for school budgets. So you'll see in May and June, we have sort of a line coming up on the top of that. That is when you have funds for school-based programs, which we're going to talk later about what this means, but school allocation memorandums, those are released, a lot of those are released in May and June. And that means that principals can start planning for the next school year using both what they think their budget will be and the projected enrollment for their budget. Those funds can continue to be released throughout the school year. So what is released in May and June are not the last funds that are released, but it's a big chunk of them. So it's enough for principals to start planning and having conversations with different groups. Some of us may be part of these groups, like school leadership teams, and it's also an opportunity for more conversation as well. The school year starts in September. And then there's another really important date that we want to flag in October. So the school budgets, the New York City school budgets that are released in May and June have a projection for enrollment. So they might assume or estimate that a school will have, for example, 400 students come September. And so they'll get a budget that will account for those 400 students. And we'll talk more about that later too. In October, New York City Public Schools will do a snapshot of all enrollment in all schools, and they'll update based on real enrollment numbers. And that also has an implication for school budgets. That school that was maybe projected to have 400 students, come October, maybe they have 420 students. And so school budgets see some changes, and we'll talk more about that later and can go into more detail if there are questions. But those are some big calendar points that have impacts for school budgets. If you go to the next slide, Hannah, thanks. Okay, so we want to talk about what funds schools, and there are a couple different intersections we want to point out. New York City schools are funded by federal funds, by state funds, and by city funds. So I'm going to give some examples of what those might be. So when we think of federal funds, there are some that are targeted support for specific groups. So something like Title I, which is specifically intended to support low-income students, or other federal laws like the IDEA law, which is intended to provide support to students with disabilities. So that's one way we see federal funds coming into school budgets. Federal funds also can go directly to the New York City Department of Education. New York City Department of Education, or the DOE, is one entity. So there we talk about different districts, like I taught in District 15, there's District 2. All of those community school districts are part of one entity of the Department of Education. So some federal funds will flow to the New York City Department of Education, which then could be distributed out to schools. There's state funds. So most of our state funding comes through a formula called foundation aid. Foundation aid was something that was much in the news this spring because the state was considering new changes to it, and IBO put out a lot of analyses on what maybe some of those changes could have had as impacts for New York City. So these funds come to the school districts across New York based on a pretty complex formula that both accounts for student enrollment, some student needs, and then an estimate of the district's capacity to provide support itself. Foundation aid comes to New York City as a whole, so New York City Department of Education, and then they use those funds to distribute out. And a lot of those funds will get distributed through what we'll later talk about of fair student funding, but there are other ways too that we see it hit school budgets. And then finally, there's city funds. So a large share of the Department of Education's budget is going to come from city funds. It covers things like staffing, programs, operation. And the little note we have on the side here is in fiscal year 2025, New York State received, so the state received 38% of its total budget from federal sources. In the same fiscal year, New York City received 17% of its budget from New York State and 8% from federal sources. And we're going to zoom in on the next slide about this as well. So this is a figure from a report we put out, we updated very recently, and it's called Department of Education Spending Since 1990. If you want to go in the weeds here, we have all of the different beautiful weeds for you to look through. So I really do recommend this on our website. It's called Education Spending. And what we're going to show and highlight here is that you can see and trace how that share of funding has changed over time. So there's a couple different things I want to point out, but I'm going to start by pointing out the Let's start with the federal share, because I think that's often on our minds. So that's actually the very bottom of this figure. So this is showing you over time from 1990 all the way to fiscal year 2024, what share of the New York City Department of Education budget is coming from federal sources. And when you look at this, you'll probably notice there's two big blips on this around 2010 and then 2022. Those were in response to two different crises. So the first was the economic crisis of 2008. There were more federal funds that came to New York City Department of Education, so the share increased. Then in 20, you see it sort of rising from 2020 through 2023. Those were the COVID stimulus funds that were released from the federal government. So our share of funds were more heavily federal than they had in the past. That number or that share is going to decrease now as those federal stimulus funds have expired. So we will see that share probably return to previous levels. There is also the next bar up, which is sort of a turquoise color. That is the state share. And you'll see that that's hovering from 45% in 1990 and moving down to about 35% by 2024. So what this is highlighting for us really is that top blue line, the city share, has actually increased over time. So the share of our budget that's coming from city funds has really grown. And in the last couple of years, it's exceeded 50% of the Department of Education's budget. And I haven't been doing a great job looking in the chat, so I'm going to keep an eye. Some of these we'll come back to, I promise. Yes, but I'm going to move ahead for now, but I see your question, John, and I think we can come back to it in a little bit too. Because we'll talk about first student funding. Thanks, Anna.
Okay, so now we're going into the interactive portion of our workshop. This is a place where you'll be able to follow along as we pull up information on our screens, and hopefully you'll be able to get a better understanding of where money is coming from for your school, as well as what it can be used for by your principal. So the goal of this activity is really just to learn how your school receives funding again from New York City Public Schools and how that funding supports the types of students in your school. You're going to learn how to read your school's budget at a glance, which is a document from the Department of Education. You'll also learn what a school allocation memorandum is. This is a financial document that the DOE uses, and we will give a definition and examples for in the next couple slides. But again, this activity is really just trying to get participants to understand where your school's money comes from and what those dollars are meant to support. So just some quick vocabulary here, or some quick review here. For most schools, the majority of funding comes from fair student funding. So fair student funding, Julia is going to talk about in a later slide, but this is a funding formula, and so it is also a per pupil funding model, and funds are going to follow students around based on the school that they enroll in. The important thing for us to know about fair student funds is that they are unrestricted. Once the New York City public school system gives principals this funding stream, principals have pretty free range in how they can use them. They are also supposed to be using input from their school leadership team to shape these hiring decisions, and FSF funds are often used for school staffing. So they're mostly used for teacher hiring and again are based on a weighted per pupil funding model. Other types of funding come from lots of different sources. They can come from the city, they can come from the state, they can come from the federal government. And we refer to these types of funding as categorical grant funds because they're meant to be used for specific programs and initiatives. These remaining funds that are outside of FSF are usually restricted. So these funds can only be used by your principal for specific types of spending that's tied to descriptions that the Department of Education gives to each school. So the first document that we are going to be looking at is called the School Budget at a Glance. There is a QR code available on the screen if you want to pull it up and use the link to find your school as we walk through the example. Julia is also going to be dropping the link in the chat for you. but I'm going to be using PS 188 as an example to reference when I'm going over this. But this again is a Department of Education resource that you can find online. In order to pull up your school's information, you just need to enter in your 4-digit school code. So some of the things that is really helpful about the budget at a glance is that it gives a really high level overview of how much your school is receiving in funds and from what different sources. So for example, for PS 188, you'll see around 61% of their funding is coming from fair student funding. Then you'll see 27% is coming from state and local funding. And then around 7% is, or sorry, 9% total is coming from federal sources. So it's a really great way just to get a high level breakdown of where your school's funds are coming from. And I also like it because it also lists some demographic information that gives you a good comparison point of how your school measures up on different demographics and needs compared to other schools around the city. So, for example, for PS 188, around 95% of their students qualify for being on the Economic Needs Index. And you can see that this is in comparison to a citywide average of 73%. So it's a good comparison point if you're just wanting to get a high level overview again of the demographics of your school. On the bottom left with the green pie chart, you'll also get to see a breakdown of the spending for the school. So you'll see how much is going to classroom teacher salaries, administrative salaries, and employee benefits, which is usually kind of health benefits for teachers and other staff in the school, as well as other than personal service. So other than personal service are services like buying furniture or buying books or types of spending that does not fall into personnel spending. So this is the first, again, high-level overview document that we're going to be looking at. And Julia is now going to go over a couple key terms for us before going more in the weeds with some documents that we'll be looking at.
I'm very happily distracted by the chat, so I'm typing at the same time. So and there's a question I'm going to come back to, so just apologies to the last question, Sarah, I think it was. Okay, so some key terms that we want to walk through that Sarah just raised a question that I was excited to answer with this next slide. There's something called a SAM. We'll hear a lot of acronyms. This is a very commonly used one. It stands for a school allocation memorandum. It's a memo that describes how the DOE is how it's allocating money to schools and why. They're normally very dense, but they're very excellent resources to try to understand questions like, where are these funds coming from? How did the DOE decide who received them? What are the eligible uses for these funds and which schools are receiving them? Almost all of that information will be in a SAM, and we're going to show you how to find those. So we'll be going over that in today's workshop. And it's also going to give you some information on how your principal is determining how to appropriate funds if they're doing it for school hiring and spending. So Sarah, your question about 3K and pre-K, often you can find information about that in a SAM. And then we're also going to show another place where you might see that, the Galaxy budgets. So Galaxy is a term that you may have heard if you've talked to your administration at a school, that they will use that as well. It's the New York City school budget system that is used by the Department of Education. So principals are working in Galaxy. A Galaxy budget allocation, as we're going to look at it too, it's basically a way for you to see how the principal of your school has allocated the funds that they received. So these are categories of or how much funding they are receiving. So you're going to see the categories of funding for individual schools. And then you can look at those names of funding and match them to a school allocation memorandum, because these allocations are explained in those, and they can sometimes have very specific uses or very general uses. So this year to date, there have been 45 of these SAMs or memos released. Last year, there were 89, which is a good time to flag too, that doesn't mean that there won't be more. Normally in a school year, you see a bunch of these memos released in June, and that's the chunk of funding going to schools. but the DOE will continue to release funds over the course of the school year. So you'll see SAMs added in October, in January, and sometimes even as late as April. There might be new memos released, and they're all posted publicly, so you can see and answer some of these questions. And then the last term that you're going to see when you start to explore school budgets is the term tax levy. And oftentimes it just shows up as TL or CTL. That stands for tax levy or city tax levy. That's a cue that the allocation of funding there is coming from New York City tax revenue, which, as we talked about before, is a major source of local school funding. So when you see those, that's just a cue that this is coming from city funds in particular. Great, so Galaxy allocations. So if you go to the Galaxy allocation page, and I think we can we'll be throwing some of these in the chat, and we can also in our breakout rooms, we can kind of walk through some of these too. We're going to show you screenshots of some of the things that you can find when you look up your own school budget. So what we're showing you here are examples, but you'll be able to look this up all on your own for your individual school. These are for PS 188. And when we do our breakout rooms, we can walk through any of these with you and answer any questions. So this is the Galaxy allocations. So this is what the principal is getting as allocations for their school. You can find this on the NYC PS website, which we can throw in the chat too. But the allocation page is basically going to list all of the SAMs that your school is getting funding through and the amount that they're getting for each of those categories. So you want to look at the names of the categories. That's going to be really helpful to you. And then obviously the amounts received. The names are really helpful because you can match those then to the list of SAMs. So for example, if we look at this PS 188, they have two SAMs that we've highlighted at the top, 3K for all and 4K for all. So for each of those allocations, they received about $250,000 for the 2025 fiscal year. That matches to the 2024-2025 school year. How I remember the fiscal school year, because it's really hard to keep track, is the fiscal year is always the last year in a school year. So if it's fiscal year 2025, we're talking about the 2024 to 2025 school year. So this is for last year. So when you look at this, you'd say, okay, I see that we're getting about $500,000 for 3K for all, for 4K for all, but I want to know more about what that means. You could then take those names and look them up on the school allocation memorandum page, and you'll see a memo that describes in a lot of detail what those are funding and some of the pieces we've talked about already. On this one also, you can see TL, fair student funding. So this is, as you can see, a big chunk of the school's funds are coming from tax levy, fair student funding. So this is a formula, which we're going to talk about later too, because it has its own SAM. But this is a formula-driven mechanism that New York City distributes funds to individual schools. And there was a great question in the chat about FSF, and have we looked at sort of the impacts of the FSF? And we have an explainer that I put in there, and then two really excellent recent reports that try to get a sense of, first, once we had full fair student funding, because it was phased in over time, did we see anything change in where teachers were hired? And then a second one that looks at two recent weights that were just added to the formula. The formula is intended to be driven by student weights. So two new weights that were added in the last couple of years was one for students in temporary housing and one for students for schools with high concentrations of students who have different needs. And there's much more detail in the report. Two other ones that we're going to talk more about shortly is Title I, which if you are a school that receives Title I funds, you will see that on your allocation categories as well. And sometimes it can be in a couple different categories, and we're going to talk more about that in just a second. Fair student funding. Okay, so this is the largest portion of school funding. If you look on the SAMs page, it's SAM number 1. That's not a coincidence because it's always the first one that is released. And this is where you see the largest share of a school's budget traditionally. And it also is where principals have some flexibility. Most often, as we've talked about already, it's used to hire teachers. The majority of a school's budget is going to be used to hire teachers, and oftentimes principals are using fair student funding to do so. It provides a base funding for all students and then additional funds through weights for students with additional needs. So the formula breaks out different, and our explainer walks through a lot of this, but there's different needs identified as then having a weight that then brings more funding. So English learners, students with disabilities, students with academic need, and this is on a per pupil basis. So a weight of 1, if a student is weighted as just 1 student, then that base amount is $4,262 for fiscal year 2026. But it's rare that a student is weighted as 1.0. Oftentimes students are weighted higher based on different characteristics and needs. So the weights for each year are presented to and then voted on by the Panel for Educational Policy, which is called the PEP, and that happens every April. So this is something that is funded by New York City tax levy and also by the state foundation aid that we mentioned before. And the TL Fair Student Funding for the school we've looked at is about $3.5 million. So that is a big chunk of that school's budget. One thing that Hannah has found and that we want to flag is that you might notice if you look at your Galaxy allocation page, the Fair Student Funding amount is slightly different from the budget at a glance amount. So those are 2 different resources. This is because your budget at a glance is also going to include fringe benefits such as healthcare and pensions, whereas the allocation page is just giving you the Fair Student Funding without that fringe benefits included. Contracts for Excellence. This is SAM number 5. So if you're looking at that page of all of the school allocation memorandum, this would be number 5. It targets funding to high need schools, and it must be used for things like class size reduction, student time on task, or teacher quality initiatives. This is a allocation of funds that are coming from our New York State Foundation aid. So it's abbreviated to C4E funds sometimes, but there are requirements attached to that funding. So it mandates that 75% of the city's total C4E funding, so the Contracts for Excellence funding, has to be allocated to the top 50% of the city's needy schools as defined by the state formula. So this is a great SAM to look at if you want to go really deep into some of the requirements there. Again, budget documents are complex, and oftentimes it takes a couple of us reading them in conversation to feel like we have perfect clarity. So if you're reading one of these SAMs and you think this is not intelligible to me, that's when you reach out to our team, and we're really eager to talk through it, share what we know, or look up what we don't. But Contracts for Excellence also can have different fiscal years, even if it's just your school budget for this year. So you might see, for example, Contract for Excellence as an allocation, and then that FY is saying some of it is from fiscal year 09, 24, 25, but grouped all together, this is your Contracts for Excellence funding that a school has within their budget. You can go to the next one, Hannah. Great. So this next is our Summer Rising. The SAM is number 7. This is something that we think might be on people's minds right now if they are have a student in Summer Rising. But these are funds to schools for the K-8 Summer Rising program. There's also high school summer course credit recovery as part of Summer Rising, and then there's some other summer opportunities as well. So school leaders will be in charge of different summer sites, and they receive funding for Summer Rising based on, in the K-8 programs, the number of available slots, then adjusted by attendance. And then for 9 through 12, it's based on the number of students who are historically mandated for summer school. What you would learn if you look at SAM number 7, this is sort of like your crib sheet, is that the funding source for this is New York City tax levy. And then also some of it is funded by Title III, which is a federal funding source, specifically the funds that are used for English language learners and multilingual services. So there might be a school that's receiving allocations for Summer Rising if they're the hosting school for Summer Rising in their building. And it will also often be spread out across these different categories. So for example, this one, there's a couple different categories. I'm pretty sure ESY Summer Rising Services, that's for related services, but I'd have to check on that. Thanks, Hannah, you're nodding. Great. And then the next one is Tax Levy Summer Rising Multilingual Support. tax levy summarizing school staff, vendors, special education support. It's broken out across. If you want to know what each of these mean, you can read in that SAM. It'll describe what these different specifics are. So there's a lot of information based on how deep you want to go. We'll go to the next slide.
Great, thank you, everyone. Apologies again for sending the wrong link. I'm sharing my screen, so it's a little difficult to toggle between the two. But the next school allocation memorandum we are looking at is number 11. This is one that you might have heard about a lot recently, but it is Title I funding. Title I funding is coming from federal funds, and they are really meant to support schools with high number of low-income students. And the funds coming to schools from Title I are meant to be used for school-wide programs such as counseling, parent engagement, and other resources that are available at the school-wide level, but are really meant to help low-income students with their academic needs. Title I is authorized under the Every Student Succeed Act, which was signed into effect under Obama. But these funds also give both Title I and also schools that are not qualifying as being Title I a per capita allocation to support students in temporary housing. That means if your school is not a Title I school, but you still have students within that school that are students in temporary housing, your school does receive additional funds as well in order to support their needs. When I'm talking about students in temporary housing and Title I funds, Title I funds also restrict this type of spending for principals, and they need to use these funds for things like buying students in temporary housing uniforms or paying for their field trips or getting parent engagement coordinators on site. So there is also a specific list of uses through which your principal can spend these Title I funds when it comes to students in temporary housing. So if we look at PS 188 for an example, they're receiving around $350,000 through Title I, and then some of that money is even further restricted. So we can see they're receiving around $3,500 for parent and family engagement, as well as $175,000 for students in temporary housing to support their needs. There's also a pretty good breakdown within the SAM looking at the citywide averages of what schools are receiving both on the city level as well as the borough level. So citywide Title I schools are receiving around $1,100 to support these low income students. And that amount also varies based on what borough you're in. Next, let's look at SAM number 26. This is the SAM that Sarah might have been wondering about further up in the chat, but this is the SAM that distributes funds to schools that have pre-K and 3K programs on site, and this funding is meant to support general and special education early childhood classrooms. So when principals receive these funds, they can hire teachers, paraprofessionals, classroom materials, and pay for startup costs. And this funding source is through New York State tax levy as well as New York State funds. I also want to caveat by saying that some pre-K and 3K programs are at times funded through federal grants, such as Head Start. Head Start, again, is a federal program that supplies pre-K and 3K and early childhood programs for low-income families. And the New York City DOE actually runs these programs through a grant sometimes in conjunction with the federal Department of Education, but there are also privately run early childhood centers that directly contract with the federal government for Head Start centers. PS 188 was a school that also did have 3K and 4K on site. And so you'll see the amount that they're receiving for that certain program listed here as well. Next, let's look at a SAM that we've actually been talking about a lot on our education team. This is SAM number 31, and it is a new SAM that was added this year to support class size reduction. So, as many of you on this call might know, New York City is being required to reduce average class sizes around the city because of a state mandate. And last year, the Department of Education announced that they would be adding this new funding stream to support schools in meeting that mandate. So at the end of last year, principals were encouraged, if they needed extra teachers to meet this mandate, to apply for these funds. And around 800 principals around New York City did apply, and 750 schools were awarded funds for the upcoming year in April. So again, this is just to kind of highlight that new SAMs are constantly being added as New York City demographics or needs change. And just to give you the example from PS 188, you'll see they're receiving around $300,000 in class size reduction planning, as well as some additional funds from contracts for excellence that is being redirected to support this school in hiring for new teachers to meet that mandate. The last thing to note about this school allocation memorandum is that once schools were approved, the amount of money they received is really tied to the amount of teachers that the DOE determined they would need to meet the mandate. And so you'll see on the bottom right for PS 188, the DOE determined that they would need 4 additional teachers in the next few years to meet that mandate. And so they received funds tied to the amount of teachers that they were allocated. So that is it for our list of school allocation memorandums. There is also a last resource that we wanted to flag for people. This is from last year, but this was the Galaxy budget spending details. So besides showcasing what a school is receiving every year, you can actually also look on Galaxy and see how your school spent funds in the previous year. So for PS 2088, for example, you're able to look at things like how many pre-K teachers there are, how many teachers for the 4th grade there are, as well as the cost associated with those positions. And so this is also a great resource for breaking down what exactly those school funds are going to, if you're wondering how your school is spending the money. Okay, that was it for our presentation. Again, there is a QR code on the screen before we split into our breakout rooms if you want to pull up your own school budget. But we're going to now split into 2 different breakout rooms where you'll be able to practice what we just went over, as well as ask any other questions that you have about your school budget or education spending in New York City.